Hello, this is Everybody Settle Down. I'm Charlie Marlow. That is the great Eric Messersmith. And we have, Eric, I don't know if it's fair to call it a stock market crash, but we have quite a dip going on today. I'm looking right now as we're recording. It is a 12:23 Central Time. The Dow is down 2.27%. The S&P 500 down 2.38%. And then I checked the old election betting odds and I see that Trump was up 1.1% and Kamala was down 1%. And I think it's a good reminder that we focus everything on Trump versus Harris, as we should, but there are other factors obviously at play. This is an obvious statement, like the economy, and we're seeing that today.
Yeah, the economy's the big one. The other one that may happen by the time you listen to this is there may be a major war in the Middle East. I mean, Iran is poised to attack Israel in a major way, probably in the coming days. And many countries are getting their citizens out of or asking their citizens not to go to Iran and Israel and Lebanon and pretty much anywhere in that area because a major war could happen. It could happen. I don't know that it will, but we're on the brink potentially, and that could impact the economic activity as well, obviously, with a lot of oil flowing through that region. But yeah, the stock market just shows you how outside events can have a major impact, and we still have 3 months to go. So that is, again, why I've always said we should really be humble about making predictions when we live in very uncertain times. Now, look, in terms of the stock market, I am not a financial expert, but I can read. And I did see somebody tweeting today that the stock market every year corrects by more than 10%. Like every 12 months, there's a big pullback. We've had record high after record high after record high this year. So a little bit of a pullback for a couple of days is not a sign the economy is about to crash or this is 1929. Okay. However, it is fair to say that the jobs report that came out Friday, that was one of the big drivers of all this, showed that we created only 114,000 jobs in July, which was the lowest number, one of the lowest numbers we've had since COVID. And the unemployment rate ticked up to 4.3%. And so there is now a growing chance of a recession. It doesn't mean we're likely headed to a recession, but it does mean that the economy has slowed down. Inflation, as we know, has slowed way down. And the Fed, it looks like, waited too long to cut interest rates. Just like when inflation started rising, in hindsight, they waited too long to raise rates. Now, it appears as if they have waited too long. They're going to meet again in September. I'm sure they're going to cut rates multiple times the rest of this year to try to head off a recession. But what have we been talking about in terms of politics in this presidential campaign for so long? Inflation. That's what we were talking about. The economy was overheated. Prices were way up. That was going to hurt Joe Biden. That was going to be maybe the biggest issue in this campaign. Prices. Economy's too hot. Now what are we talking about? The economy may slow down too much. We may the Fed may not have cut rates quick enough, and now the problem is on the other side. Not inflation anymore. Now all of a sudden we may have job losses in a recession. So yeah, things change fast.
Yeah. First of all, I think when I say funny, when I hear people talk about a recession, and I understand the textbook definition of a recession in terms of what it's two consecutive quarters where you have the negative GDP growth. But I feel like we've actually been so because recession has a definition, we can't call it a recession. But I would say that we've been in an economic downturn since COVID hit. So I find it funny sometimes when everybody's like, "Oh, here comes a recession." Well, it's like prices have been super high for a couple of years. The housing market has been nutty essentially since COVID hit. So we focus on this definition of a recession where I think it's pretty fair to say that the economic world has been turned upside down in the United States since about March of 2020. And has it gotten better? Yes. But overall, it's been a pretty nutty for 4.5 years. The other thing, and again, I shouldn't say I find this funny, but what always bothers me is the politicalization of the economy. And I see so many people, and I've worked with people like this. I see them on social media, and you can tell they're rooting for this, right? The second they're celebrating the stock market crash, whatever you want to call it, they never say anything positive when it goes up. And by the way, just so everybody knows, there's people on the other side that do the exact opposite when a Democrat, you have a Democrat president, you have a Republican president, they do the opposite. I saw this under Trump. Everything's terrible. But I do find it funny when we've had a record high stock market essentially every month for the last couple years, and nobody talks about that. The second you have a really bad day or two, folks are celebrating it. And I do think it's just a reminder of how politicized we are. And some of these people that just they are, and look, Bill Maher said this several years ago and got criticized for it, kind of rooting for a recession to get rid of Trump. That was wrong. It was wrong. And this is wrong too. When you're celebrating people losing their jobs and losing money because you think it helps your candidate, it's really stupid.
It really is. It's part of a larger trend, though, that you and I have talked about since we started, of the intense team sport aspect of politics now and the intense tribalism. And it shows up in everything. Like, another example is whenever there is a mass shooting, who the perpetrator is, you almost feel like people are rooting for it, to be like either on one side, a white male who maybe has some right-wing tendencies. On the other side, people may be rooting for it.
Illegal immigrant.
Right, or a trans. It's crazy. But that is, and look, I'm not saying this is a lot of people, but I'm saying if you don't think this is happening, it clearly is on X. I think it happens much more when it comes to the economy, right? Because look, it hurts the incumbent administration when the economy is bad. Like, that is not earth-shattering, right? If George H.W. Bush in 1992 didn't have that little economic downturn, Bill Clinton may have never been president. I mean, these things matter. McCain may have beaten Obama. Who knows if the housing market didn't crash in late 2008. It matters a lot, even if the incumbent president is not on the ballot, with Joe Biden not being there. Look, the economy has been post-COVID a mixed bag. On the one hand, I'm not talking about right now today, because things change day to day. I'm saying in the period since Joe Biden became president, right? It's important to remember when he became president, lots of people were still dying. The vaccine wasn't quite here yet. The world was turned upside down, right? What's happened to the economy in those 3 years? We've had on the plus side, record stock market highs up until obviously the last few days. But overall, your 401k has done well in the last 3 years. We've had record job growth. We had unemployment below 4% for the longest period we'd seen in 50 years. Wage growth in the last few years, after stagnating, has been very strong. Inflation that went crazy, where prices are up 20% from 3 years ago, but now in recent months has come down, and come down so far that, again, inflation is no longer the main worry. The main worry now is on the other side, which is employment and the economy. Interest rates went up. Housing is expensive. What I'm trying to say is the economy has been a mixed bag. It's not been wonderful. It's not been terrible. Overall, what matters to me as someone who trying to be fair is, how do you come out of that? Like, we had that incredible shock to our system. As Biden points out, and look, this is fair, we have weathered it better than almost any other advanced democracy in the world, right? You can't really compare it to China, because China skews their numbers, and who really knows what's going on in China. But even compared to China, from what we know, we've done pretty well. My point is, Americans don't care about that, right? They don't care so much we're doing better than France, right? They're like Britain or Japan stock. Like, if you've seen what's happened in the Nikkei, the Japanese stock market in the last few days, you talk about a crash. I mean, that is a crash. So, but nobody cares about that for the most part, right? People just care about, what do I see in my bank account? What are the vibes? How do I feel, right? That's really what people care about. What do I see on social media? And so what actually happens in the numbers kind of gets lost in the shuffle. And to that extent, this is helping Trump. And in fact, he went on his True Social today and said, "I told you so." Like, so I just think it's so interesting. Remember, he took credit when the stock market went up earlier this year, because he said that means people think I'm going to win. But now that it's going down, he's trying to blame Biden. And it just goes back to this. And look, I want to be clear. Both sides.
Kamala. He's blaming Kamala.
Right. He's blaming Kamala. Both sides do this, but Trump is just the most shameless about it that I have ever seen. Like, basically, his campaign is anything good that has happened while I was president or after I left office. So during the last 7 years, I get credit for, but everything that went bad while I was in office or after I left office for, I get zero blame for. I mean, that's essentially his argument. And there are people that buy it. Of course, it's not true. It has no basis really in reality, but that is essentially the argument he is shamelessly trying to make. I get credit for everything, whether I'm president or not, and I get blamed for nothing, whether I'm president or not.
You know, you talk about vibes. It does seem like this is a vibes election. And look, I think it's fair to say I'm trying to go back the night that Trump was shot. That was about 3 weeks ago, I believe. So this
Charlie,
is
that was
really
way, way back. It seems
right.
like 20 years ago, but yeah, that was 3 weeks ago.
Okay. So think about it like this. You mentioned this stock market crash, whatever you want to call it. It's helping Trump. And it is. I'm looking at the betting odds right now. So Trump's around 53%. He was about 51-ish percent over the weekend when I looked. And I bring that up because I believe the night he was shot, right after that, he has the strong response. He's got the bloody face in air. He says, fight, fight, fight. And at that time, Biden is still essentially the person he's running against. But I believe the election betting odds were about 68 or 69% for Donald Trump. I bring this up because in the last 3 weeks, it has been all negative for Trump, and it's been a nice, steady progression for the Harris campaign until today. And I think there's a lot of things that factor in. To me, the biggest one is clearly Joe Biden stepping aside for Harris, but also I think JD Vance was a bit of a negative so far, has been a bit of a negative for Trump. And I think so far, Kamala Harris has been a little better than expected, although I think there's still a lot of places the right can attack her. I also think Trump last week with the NABJ conference, NABJ conference, and the whole biracial thing, you saw also that his odds took a little dip after that because I think he stepped in it there, didn't make any sense. I'm just trying to say basically 3 great weeks for the Democrats, and now Trump's seeing a little bit of a bump with what's going on today economically.
Yeah. Well, I'll just correct you briefly. 2 great weeks for the Democrats because the week prior was an incredible week for Trump because it was the shooting leading into the RNC, which
RNC,
most
right.
people gave pretty good reviews. But since then, of course, it's changed. We spoke about this at length, last week about the reaction to Harris and the switch. So I won't go into all of that again. But what I will say is it continues to amaze me how flat-footed Trump, his campaign, many of his surrogates in the media, Republican elected officials, it continues to amaze me how a very predictable event left them so befuddled, right? Like something that we all knew could happen. And as the summer went on after the debate, became more and more likely that it would happen, has left them just like shell-shocked. And what is the way it's presented itself with Trump is it's like the one thing that is going to be the least effective and will backfire on you is going after her race or gender, right? Like, so if you were running against Kamala Harris, right, and you had a meeting, you would say, look, there's a lot here. She was the district attorney in San Francisco. She helped push some liberal criminal justice reforms that you could argue led to crime. She was the attorney general of California. There's Proposition 47, which is the big thing out here that passed while she was attorney general that limited or that raised the threshold to make shoplifting a felony up to $950. We talked about that before. It's now a misdemeanor under that amount. She ran a disastrous presidential campaign, talked about things like abolishing ICE, talked about things like defunding the police, all of this stuff, right? Then the Biden administration in charge of the border, which isn't really true, but look, this is politics and people distort things all the time. My point is there's a lot to attack. But what do they choose to make a big focus? And what does Trump choose to, in front of a black audience, talk about? She just decided she's black. She was Indian, as if I don't know. Can he not grasp the concept that some people are biracial and have different racial identities? Like, that is the one thing you should stay away from. And yet we hear it over and over again. The same thing with the Willie Brown thing, and she slept her way to the top, and all of these arguments that play well in the echo chamber of right-wing social media, but do not play well to the broad general audience of people who are going to decide this election in 6 battleground states. And it just amazes me that when Trump was on that stage, which just shows you he hasn't changed. He hasn't at core, like, he's a better politician than he was in 2016. And he certainly has a better political operation. The people running his campaign are pros. And so that is improved. But at base, he's still the same guy that came down that escalator. The shooting didn't change him. That near-death experience didn't change him. He is what he is at core. And that interview, the whole interview was a shit show. But in particular, that segment about her not deciding she was black, I'm just like, this guy, he cannot help himself. He just can't. He cannot be. Why? Think about it. He did a pretty good job at being on message and discipline when it was Joe Biden. But the moment the switch came, and look, we can speculate as to why this is. Some people will say it's because he's now running against a black woman. I think it's because he really thought it was inevitable he was going to win. And then he and his campaign realized, oh shit, we're in a dogfight. And I think that kind of brought out those old instincts of Trump. And he just can't help himself. Like, when people are sympathetic to him and he tragically nearly dies from an assassin's bullet and he has all this goodwill, he goes to the RNC and he's got the bandage on his ear and people are feeling sorry for him probably for the first time ever. And he gives an incredible speech for the first half hour at the RNC about the shooting and what it was like and the firefighter who died, and he goes over and like hugs the firefighter's jacket. I'm thinking, man, maybe this guy's changed, right? Near-death experience, maybe. And then the next half of the speech is just back to the old Trump, lies and distortions and kind of that old Trump that a lot of people don't like. And that NABJ thing, man, it's not that I couldn't believe it because of what I just said. It's that I just can't understand how these Republicans are not able to discipline themselves in the messaging against Harris that could be the most effective. Because just like any politician who's been around a while, there is a lot there to attack. But the one thing that you shouldn't attack is her race. A, because it doesn't play well, but B, because it's ludicrous. Like, she's always been half black and half Asian. I don't understand why people can't see that. Like, it's not like she hid it. It's been there for her whole life.
Yeah, I think so. I think what happened with that press conference, with that interview is, and I forgot the woman's name that asked the first question that was
Rachel Scott from ABC.
Rachel Scott. That first question came hard. I mean, real hard, bringing up everything he's ever said or done against black people. And I think he was so pissed about that tilted him. If you're a poker player, I think he was immediately on tilt and coming back aggressive because he was really not happy with that first question, which I think was a fair question. Again, it was coming real strong out of the gate. I do give Trump credit for being there, to be honest with you. But then the rest of it was a shit show. I mean, it was not a good performance from Trump at all. And I find the racial thing funny because I consider myself, I'm just a boring white person, right? But I have a bunch of different, I have a bunch of different European nationalities, right? I can show you my 23andMe. So I'm British, I'm Irish, I'm German. I can celebrate all those, but it's just because
Charlie, you have to pick one and then stick with that the rest of your life. That is clearly the world we live in now. And if you ever try to change it, you have been essentially living a lie your whole life. That's apparently the new rules.
Right. And I choose Ireland on St. Patrick's Day. And depending on how these soccer teams do, there's a lot of things about Germany you don't want to really claim.
Well, yeah. As a Messersmith, I can totally understand that.
But it's just funny because in the same way that I could so obviously say I am German and Irish and British, and you know what? Donald Trump is probably the same. I don't know exactly, but he's probably a mutt of European descent. But it's just funny when it's Indian and Jamaican or black, whatever you want to call it. Like, it's such this big deal because she's half Asian, which I know a lot of people, they don't really consider Indian Asian, but it is. But we can say Indian,
Yeah.
and her dad's Jamaican. So that's black. And it's just like, because she's these two different ethnicities, which really aren't
Yeah.
that different than being German and Irish, except for the way it impacts the color of your skin, it like makes his head implode. And I just
It
think
does.
it's the worst strategy, especially
It's
when
yeah.
you see that like 33% of the country now are biracial. It's just such an unforced error. It's so stupid.
Yeah, if you would so right now, Harris is ahead in most of the polling averages. Not all, some outlets do it differently, but she has now moved ahead. And Nate Silver's forecast, she is now for the first time favored to win the election. Not by much. It's like 51, 49. It's a toss-up. The polls show it's a toss-up. The betting market show it's a toss-up. The election forecasting models show it's a toss-up. It was not a toss-up 3 weeks ago. It was not. Trump, before Biden got out, was a 2-1 roughly favorite in the betting
Mhm.
markets. He had a nice lead in the polling average. So why has it changed? Well, obviously, a big part of it is subbing out a candidate who wasn't up for this for a candidate who is, right? That's part. But the argument is, my argument is that is not all of it. It's not just, that's the main reason, obviously, Harris and Biden out. But it's also the response of Trump and the Republicans. They'd be doing better if they had responded better. And I mentioned Nate Silver earlier. I want to give him credit for this because he's a big poker player. You mentioned this. If you're not familiar with on tilt, that means essentially you're playing poker and you have a hand that you think you should win and you lose because you get a bad beat, they call it. Bad luck, right? A queen flops on the river, whatever. And you lose. And then instead of just playing smart, you start playing angry and you make dumb decisions. And Nate Silver's point was, I didn't think that Kamala Harris being in would cause Trump to go on tilt. And that is what has happened. Trump has gone on tilt. Now, look, there's a long time to go. As I mentioned, there is fertile ground to attack Harris, as there is for any politician. So he has plenty of time to course correct. But they need to course correct because the last 2 weeks have been really, really bad for the Trump campaign.
Okay, I want to allot a lot of time for RFK at the end because we have some fun stuff with the bear and then his comments about both Trump and Biden. The
Uh,
old Veep stakes though. So I'm looking at the same election betting odds. Josh Shapiro with a 69.4% chance. Tim Walz 27% chance. So it looks like it's basically a two-horse race right now. You and I both like Shapiro. You got to think Shapiro gets you Pennsylvania. Is it Walls or Walsh, by the way?
I believe it's
It's
I believe it's
Walz.
Waltz with a Z
Okay,
sound.
Waltz.
Waltz.
So,
Yeah.
and I say that because I'd never heard of this dude, by the way. I'd never heard of him until about 2 weeks ago, but now you see him all over the place campaigning, and he seems like just a great messenger for the Midwest and for all these states you're looking to basically solidify along the blue wall. He just seems like a real down to earth kind of working class dude. So, I don't know who's going to get it. Obviously right now, Shapiro is the heavy favorite.
Yeah, the reporting is that Kelly, the other finalist, the Arizona senator, is no longer in the running. So it appears to be those two. A decision coming very soon because tomorrow, we're recording this on Monday, Tuesday. Harris and her VP are going to start a swing state tour in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where Shapiro is from. Look, Waltz has come from nowhere, really. He was not mentioned initially when we talked about who would be the white guy, because, it was always like, well, it's going to be a white guy, right? He was not mentioned as one of the white guys right away, the Minnesota governor. But he's acquitted himself well, and he's earned this because he was really the one, I think, who kind of started the Trump is weird, Vance is weird kind of thing with an interview he did. And then the Harris campaign picked up on that. And if you've seen him in some of these clips, he's good. I mean, he's funny. He's got a kind of a good Midwestern sensibility about him, that Minnesota nice thing that Amy Klobuchar, tapped into when she ran for president in 2020. So he's earned it. I want to be clear. And I think he's a skilled politician. But Josh Shapiro, I'm telling you, I've been watching these things for a long time. That dude is at a different level. He is as good as I have seen in recent years. And if you put him on a national stage, I think he will kill it. Look, Walz is fine too. I don't think it'd be a terrible choice. But here's the difference. You are very likely to win Minnesota anyway, okay? And Minnesota's not going to decide this election, either way. If you lose Minnesota, that means you've gotten blown out. And if you win Minnesota, well, who cares? You need to win it anyway. Pennsylvania is probably the most important state. When you combine how close the polling is and the number of electoral votes, 19, I think Pennsylvania is very likely to be the state that decides, or as likely as any other. Harris almost certainly has to win Pennsylvania. Like, could you imagine a scenario where she could get to 270 electoral votes without Pennsylvania? Yes, she's doing better than Biden in Georgia, in Arizona, in North Carolina. She has made those states much more competitive. It is possible that she could lose Pennsylvania and still get to 270, but it's very unlikely. And on the other hand, if she does win Pennsylvania, she's been polling better in Michigan than Pennsylvania. If she wins Pennsylvania, that almost certainly means she's also won Michigan, and then she only needs one more state: Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia. She's pretty much there. Shapiro is the sitting governor. He just won a landslide election. He's very popular. He will probably give you a point or two in a state where a point or two may be the difference. Like, do not overthink this. Do not blow this decision. Harris and her campaign, I think, have done really well these first 2 weeks. They've been bold. They've acted decisively. They have made the smart strategic decisions. And this is a no-brainer. Do not fuck this up. Like, if you pick Walz and you lose Pennsylvania by 2 points, which is a very possible scenario, you will just, it'll be like a Hillary Clinton not going to Wisconsin and Michigan level error. I mean, usually vice presidential candidates don't matter. This one could matter. It could be the difference. Do not overthink this. Josh Shapiro is the obvious choice. And here's the other thing. If he's not the choice, it will be because you let politics, and what I'm specifically saying is you let the online left. We've been bashing earlier in this show people who are very, conservative and are in that camp. If you don't pick Shapiro, it will obviously be because of the attacks against him from very liberal people who are very online and do not like him for a variety of reasons. But let's be honest, a lot of it is anti-Semitism. He is Jewish. We know that has become a thing with a large section of very liberal people in this country. And there was a quote, Jake Auchincloss, I think is how you say his last name. He is a Democratic congressman from Massachusetts. And today he said on CNN, quote, "Those in the openly online left who are attacking Josh Shapiro's pro-Israel position in a different way than they're attacking non-Jewish Veep contenders' positions, they're just telling on themselves. There's a strong undercurrent of anti-Semitism. It's unacceptable." And he is absolutely right. Josh Shapiro is Jewish, but his position in Israel is very aligned with Kamala Harris, with the mainstream, with Joe Biden, with the mainstream of the Democratic Party. He has criticized Benjamin Netanyahu and said that Benjamin Netanyahu is, quote, "one of the worst leaders of all time." That's what Josh Shapiro has said. He has a very, very similar position to all mainstream Democrats. So the attacks on him are clearly, some of them, represented in anti-Semitism. And if Harris and her people allow that to derail the nomination of what is the obvious choice to try, A, because he's really good, and B, because he comes from the most important state, it would be a political blunder of, I think, epic proportions. And this is how you know the arguments are so weak. One of the arguments against Shapiro is that when he was, let me check my notes, 20 years old in college, he wrote an op-ed calling for a potentially a solution in Israel that did not have a two-state solution, saying it may never come because the other side isn't ready for it, meaning the Palestinians, right? 30 years ago, he wrote this when he was 20. And this is what people are using to say that he shouldn't be the vice president, even though now, if you've listened to him recently, he has unequivocally said that he supports a two-state solution. Again, the mainstream position of Joe Biden, of Kamala Harris, of basically the entire Democratic Party. And so look, again, we have gone after the far right on this show and some of their crazy beliefs. You see it with the left too, man. These people that hang out online and only talk to people who think like them and think Josh Shapiro is some like super, super right-wing Israeli guy when he is not, just primarily because he's Jewish. It's wrong. And I think Harris and her campaign will make the right decision. But if they don't, let's face it, this is going to be the reason. This will be the reason they don't pick Shapiro. And it would be a terrible mistake.
Okay, to play devil's advocate, and I won't jump right into the anti-Semitism thing, but I'll say this. What about the argument that even before Shapiro was being considered, because go back several months. So several months ago, there were a lot of people on the extreme left criticizing Joe Biden, Kamala Harris for their stance on Israel-Palestine as well. And this whole argument that, oh, you could lose Michigan because of the larger Muslim population. So take the anti-Semitism out of it and just look at it from an electoral situation. Could you make the argument that if you bring in Shapiro, who essentially is kind of double downing on the same type of stance as Biden and Harris, that you still could be vulnerable to losing Michigan? I think that's a fair thing to bring up.
No, I'm glad you said that, because I think that is a fair argument. I think the people who make it don't make it in good faith, most of them. I think they make it because they don't. So that's my point. I think it's hard to separate the anti-Semitism from the good faith argument. Now, let's tackle the good faith argument, because I think that is really the only credible argument against Shapiro. That's the only argument that I think carries any weight whatsoever, is what is the net gain he gives you. And I would just say this. If you look at the polling, Harris is doing better in Michigan than she is in Pennsylvania. So she can afford a little bit of loss in Michigan for a potential big gain in Pennsylvania. So I think from a just numbers perspective, I think the numbers would show you that Shapiro would help more than he would hurt. And again, what is likely to be the critical state. The second thing I would say is I am skeptical that you will lose a lot of people. Are there a few on the margins who you may lose if you pick Shapiro? Oh, sure. But I'm skeptical that a lot of people in, let's say, Michigan, a lot of Arab Americans or Muslim Americans who otherwise were going to vote for Kamala would leave and vote for Trump or not vote at all and essentially help Trump win because she picked a vice president who on the issues involving Israel has basically the same position she does. You see what I'm saying? So you would have to imagine a voter who is right now, as we sit here today, pro-Harris and is planning to vote for her, who now tomorrow, if she picks Shapiro, will vote for Trump or RFK Jr. not vote at all because she picked a vice president who essentially has the same positions as her. Like, again, could you find a voter who believes that? Yes. I think you can find voters who believe pretty much anything. My point is I find it hard to believe there's a large number of those voters, and I definitely do not think that the number of those voters is larger than the voters Shapiro will bring you, particularly in Pennsylvania. And also, let's remember, there are a lot of Jewish Americans. Jewish Americans traditionally have been very liberal. They vote Democrat in very large numbers. And there have been a lot of them that have left the Democratic Party or have flirted with Trump because they think that the Biden administration has gone too far the other way. So maybe having a Jewish vice president who believes Israel has a right to exist, maybe that helps you with some of those voters too. And I think it will. And so my point is, if you're looking at purely the numbers, I think the numbers will show you that Shapiro would bring you more than you would lose from his selection.
Okay, you mentioned RFK Jr. We have a strong, loyal RFK Jr. fandom on this channel, and boy, do we got some things to talk about. So let's start with this bear story, which is just hilarious because you texted me the story yesterday. I think it was in Instagram or Twitter, whatever it was. And it was just so odd. I mean, I'm like, why is Roseanne there? You know, why is he talking to Roseanne? It didn't make any sense. And when you sent it to me, I didn't really know anything about it. So I'm like, is this a joke? Like, what's happening? So for people that don't know, basically back in the day, about 10 years ago, RFK Jr. is going falconing. He's big into hawks and falcons, and he sees this
Aren't we all,
baby.
Charlie?
Yes, aren't we all? He sees this baby bear that was hit by a car. It's dead. He puts it in his car because he's going to skin it for the meat, which is legal in the state of New York. But then they hunt longer than they thought. He goes to a dinner, and I think it was more downtownish. And so this bear is in the back of his car, and he said, people were drinking and people were having fun. Not him, because he is in recovery. But there was at the time apparently stories of bikers in the bike lane being killed. And so a bunch of people are essentially, I think, drinking at this dinner, and RFK Jr. has to get to the airport. So they kind of think it would be funny if they pretend like this bear was killed by a bicycle in Central Park. And RFK Jr. happened to have a bike in his car too. So they set it up. This is about 10 years ago, for this bear to look like it got hit by the bike. It became a big story. But then apparently there's this New Yorker piece that just came out today where RFK Jr. had to explain it. Hopefully I explained it to folks, but they should go watch it. It's only like 3.5 minutes. It's just crazy because like Roseanne Barr or Arnold, whatever her name is, she's there. I'll be honest, I thought it was hilarious. And I thought it was pretty funny. Like, I didn't look at RFK Jr. any worse, because I was thinking, if I was at a dinner party 10 years ago and everybody's drinking and you got this friend that has a bear in their back seat, I would think the same thing, right? Like, I think it's pretty funny. I think it's hilarious.
It's something. Look, this is not a Kristi Noem situation. Like so he didn't kill the bear, so this is not nearly anything like that. It's so interesting on so many levels. First of all, the video, he's not only is he talking to Roseanne Barr, he's sitting in a kitchen of what appears to be just maybe it's her house. She's standing with a cup of coffee. There's people in the background moving about. It's not like they're sitting down for a formal interview. And he's just recanting this story about this bear. Did he just show up at Roseanne's house? Do they live close together? Like, I need more context about how he and Roseanne came to be discussing the bear. That's number one. Number two, I grew up in Altoona, Pennsylvania, pretty rural area. And I know that there are people that I've heard here or there have taken roadkill. Usually it's a deer where I'm from, but I wouldn't say it's a common thing. I know if I drive by roadkill, my first inclination is not, let me get out and take a look and see if I can throw it in my car because I might be able to skin it for meat later. Like, it's a little strange. I'm just going to say it, to drive by roadkill and throw it in your trunk. It's a little weird. Yes,
listen,
rebut me, please.
I'm going to disagree with you because, dude, Eric, I have people in my family and friends that say the exact opposite. I have farmer friends, an uncle. Here, I'll give you a quick story. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I thought of this.
I want the other side of this, because to me, my thought would never be, there's a dead bear, let me get it in my car. That wouldn't be my first thought.
This wasn't about a bear, but it was 2008. I had just moved from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan to Lansing, Michigan. I'm driving back up to the Upper Peninsula to visit my girlfriend at the time. I'm driving on a highway in Michigan where the speed limit's 70, so I'm probably going 79 or 80 on cruise control, and I smoke a big-ass deer. I'm talking about a daddy deer, a buck. I split this thing in half. It ruined my car. When I say I split it in half, I mean like it split my car. It wrapped around my car, ruined my car. I had a crappy car at the time. But when I told people from Michigan and when I told some of my family members that are farmers that story, the first thing they said was, did you keep the deer for the meat? That's the first thing. I go, hell no, I kept going. I didn't even stop the car because I could tell my car was so messed up. I thought if I stopped, it might not start again. I kept driving all the way to the Upper Peninsula with a beat up freaking hood, everything
Yeah.
like the air conditioning and the heat was all jacked up because I figured if I turned that car off, it wasn't turning back on. But every single person I know that hunted, the first thing they asked me was, "Did you scoop up the deer for the meat?"
Yeah, I want to be clear. This is probably my coastal elitism, right? Grew up in central Pennsylvania. Now I live in the LA area. So look, there's a cultural thing there where people grab animals. Not my thing, but okay. But let's think this through. You decide you're going to grab the animal because you want the meat for later. Fine. Okay. Well, I wouldn't do it. Whatever. You throw it in your hatch. You then are on apparently a pretty tight time schedule, right? Because he said he drove to New York City, then had a flight out. Maybe, I don't know, if you're not certain you can get the bear to a place where you could freeze it first, which I assume, again, this is out of my comfort zone, but I'm assuming that's what you would need to do to preserve it, right? Is you would need to freeze it. If you don't think you can do that, I don't know, maybe don't put the dead bear in your hatch. That's number one. Number two, if you then decide anyway to put the dead bear in your hatch, drive to New York City, have dinner, maybe don't throw it in Central Park. Look, is this a disqualifying thing as president? I'm not saying that. Is this a Kristi Noem situation? No. What I am saying is it is, and this is where the RFK people who already probably don't like me are going to come at me. It's another, we talk about weird with Trump. It's another weird thing on an already weird fire of RFK Jr. Like, look, again, I want to be clear. I like RFK Jr. This is part of the reason I like him because he is weird. He seems like he'd be a great guy to have a beer with. I would love to have a beer or coffee. I guess he doesn't drink. I'd love to hang out and have dinner with RFK Jr. He's an interesting guy. He has had an interesting life. He's a smart guy. He's got a good sense of humor. I personally like him. Do I want this man anywhere near the nuclear codes in the Oval Office? I'm sorry, I don't. I do not. Not just because of this bear incident, I want to be clear. But it's another thing. Like, the guy is just, I don't know. I don't know what the right word is.
He's interesting.
I like him. Okay. There's a lot of people I like who I would never vote for to be president of the United States. I mean, and then the call. So another thing in this New Yorker story that you talked about that was released today is that apparently RFK Jr. has described Trump as, quote, a terrible human being in recent text messages, the worst president ever, barely human, probably a psychopath. Now, you may agree or disagree with a lot of those characterizations, but that is not how RFK Jr. talks about Donald Trump, right? He usually talks about him in fairly warm terms. He actually said Biden was a bigger threat to democracy than a man that you just let me make sure I'm quoting this right. So think about this. You have publicly said that there's two other candidates, right, at the time, Biden and Trump. You have publicly said that the bigger threat to democracy is not the man you describe as a terrible human being, the worst president ever, barely human, and probably a psychopath. That is in private what you're saying about one of the candidates, but in public,
Sociopath.
Sociopath. Yes,
big
sociopath.
Difference.
Big difference. Right. So that's what you say about one of the candidates in private, but in public, you say the other candidate is the bigger threat to democracy. So look, if you love RFK, and I know your wife does, and your wife is a wonderful woman, and I am not going to criticize you for voting for whatever candidate you feel like. I'm just talking about from me, from my perspective. I think the dude is a little bit off his rocker. And that's not even getting, and again, we could spend an hour on the vaccine conspiracy stuff, and I don't want to do that. But I have looked into this because I want to be fair. And so I have looked into what RFK Jr. has said about vaccines, and I have looked at what other people say. And again, I know he tries to say he's not anti-vaccine. It's bullshit. He was incredibly anti-vaccine for almost his entire life. Yeah, right. I mean, the conspiracy theories about vaccines cause autism, which has been debunked numerous times. There was a measles outbreak in another country that he was partially responsible for because his company or his organization said, don't get the measles shot. And like 50 kids died. I mean, there's example, the COVID conspiracies that he launched. And then he says, oh, no, I didn't really mean that, implying that Hank Aaron died because he had the COVID vaccine, which wasn't true, saying the COVID vaccines were not effective. They were incredibly effective. They saved the lives of around the world millions of people. So again, that doesn't mean he's not a smart guy. That doesn't mean I don't like him. That doesn't mean I don't think he's fun or he has a good sense of humor. I think all those things. But this is just another story about this guy being weird.
That is the word now. That is the word now of this election, since Democrats, see, for a while it was vibes, but now Democrats, they've got this good little slogan they're very proud of calling Trump and the Republicans weird. And now we have RFK Jr. doing weird things. I think, and again, I look at it like this. Okay, would I rather have Trump or RFK as president? I'd rather have RFK.
Me
I
too.
think, yeah,
Me too.
I think Kamala is normal, which is why I think it's funny that, of course, now everybody has to say on the right that she's the worst candidate ever, but they would say the same thing if it was Mayor Pete or Gavin Newsom. We're just in this place where everybody's terrible, which I don't think, because I don't think Nikki Haley's terrible. I don't think that Ron DeSantis is terrible. I don't think Kamala Harris is terrible, nor is she great, by the way. I don't think she's this dynamic politician. She'll have the chance to prove herself over the next 3 months or so. I don't know. The RFK Jr. Bear story to me makes me laugh because that's something I would do. Like, I would be along with him in the park setting up the bike. But then again, I don't think you guys want me to be president.
No,
but
I probably would too.
Yeah, I think it's hilarious and I think it's funny. The vaccine,
and I want to be clear. I just want to be clear, Troy. It was just this bear thing, right?
Yeah.
This bear thing is not that big of a deal. It's not.
Right.
It's a funny, interesting story. I want to be clear on that. I'm not basing my opinion solely or exclusively on the bear story. I just want to be clear on that for the record.
And see, my vaccine discussion about RFK is a little different because I actually disagree with him more on the COVID vaccine. But, and I say this big picture, in general, I agree with a lot of things he says about the vaccine schedule. And while we've talked about this is, personal to both you and I, like, my wife and I have both acknowledged this, that my son's skin issues and eczema, it was not there at birth. And it really started after that 2-month vaccine schedule. And could that be random? Sure. But I do think the fact that back in the day, you had 6 vaccines and now there's 72, whatever it is. And let's be honest, big medicine, big pharma, there's been a lot of instances of them looking more for profit than for people's health. Again, that's big picture. We can talk about OxyContin. We can talk about a lot of different things. So I do think he's on to something there, big picture. I'm not saying I agree with everything that he stands for, but if you have a child like mine, we're about ready to go to California to the Food Allergy Institute, and he is allergic to everything on earth, and he has eczema, and you start to read that a lot of this eczema and food allergy stuff did come about. There's kind of a direct line to the legislation being passed that basically took liability away from corporations for these vaccines. I mean, I think there's a lot there to investigate. So that's where, big picture, I'm kind of with him on some of this stuff. The COVID vaccine, I'm not with him on all that. But I don't know. I do think he's opened up a necessary discussion on a lot of these things. And if you go back to the Joe Rogan interview of a year and a half ago, he basically said, look, I didn't start out as this kook that was basically talking about vaccines. He's like, I was trying to, keep the Hudson River clean and safe for water. He goes, but after these talks, all these moms kept coming up to me and saying, look into this. It wasn't like this was his life's work. He said a bunch of these moms kept coming up to him and talking to him and saying, look into this. We think there's something there. That's how it started for him.
Yeah, look, I want to be clear because I think it's important to be fair. I agree with you that there are legitimate issues. And see, this is what RFK Jr. does. He's a smart guy. And so a lot of what he talks about has a grain of truth in it. And big picture, I totally agree. And this is one of the things I like about RFK Jr., talking about the issues with our food supply, the pharmaceutical industry, the greed and corruption there. That's all fine. And even talking about the vaccine schedule, I think it's totally a legitimate question. Should these be spaced out more? That's all fair game. But what he does, and again, in my opinion, I know the RFK Jr. people are going to hate me. What he does,
But they'll
and I would just,
watch.
they'll watch. What he does, he's very good. This is what really smart, articulate people do when they make an argument. Is he takes a big picture argument that is legitimate, and then he riddles his argument to back it up with inaccuracies, or he takes a grain of truth and then spins it forward. And again, I would just encourage you, the fact checks are there. They're all over the place. Just Google it. You can read it for yourself and make up your own mind. And if you, and this idea that he's not anti-vax, look, when you say these kind of things, I mean, on the Bill Maher show, he said, quote, my belief, this was this year, about that, meaning the COVID shot, is there is no advantage to the vaccine. That's a direct quote. My belief about that is there is no advantage to the vaccine. I mean, that's crazy. I'm sorry, that is crazy. That vaccine has saved millions of people's lives. Look at the death rates of people in 2021 who had the vaccine and who didn't, right? Because at that point, roughly half the population had it and half did. It was a stunning difference. And also consider that the half that had it were older and sicker. Most of the people that didn't were younger and healthier, and yet they were dying at much higher rates than the half that was vaccinated. I mean, it's just, so I want to be clear. I agree with everything you said. I think it's totally legitimate to question the pharmaceutical industry, the food supply, vaccine schedules. That's all fair game. But I think what RFK Jr. does is he uses that to then spread a lot of just inaccurate misinformation about things like the COVID vaccine that, again, on net was we might still be right if we didn't have the vaccine, in a very bad place from COVID. And I mean, could you imagine if he was president and we had another viral outbreak? I mean, think about that for a second. If you really imagine it. So now RFK Jr. is president, and you have another disease like COVID that hits us, but let's say it's even more deadly. What's going to happen with vaccines in that scenario? I mean, I think it's a fair question to ask, right? What would be his position if that kind of thing would happen again? Now, as we've talked about, he's never going to be elected president, so he even knows that. But I think it's a fair question to ask.
Yeah, and see, what I think is, first of all, I think everybody does have to acknowledge that what they told us about the vaccine was not accurate, in the sense of you're not going to get COVID, right? So
Yes.
anybody pushing back on that, they certainly oversold the vaccine and what it would do and what it would accomplish. I agree with you that
they oversold it. I agree with you. They oversold it in terms of not, because the initial, if you go back and read it, their initial reports showed that transmission was also lowered in addition to severe outcomes. But what happened is we had the Omicron variant. And when the Omicron variant came, then it showed that the transmission, the vaccine did not do a good job of blocking transmission. So again, he's right on that. He's right. He is correct. The vaccine did not do a great job of blocking transmission, and that was overpromised. But then he extrapolates that to mean, well, it also doesn't do a good job of preventing death, and therefore it's bad, or as he said, has no advantage. And so that's what I'm saying about what he does to, I think, great effect, is he takes something that is true and he then uses that grain of truth to extrapolate into a much larger argument that isn't true.
Yeah, and I was basically going to say a similar thing about the variants. When you talk about that the vaccine was, and again, I'll quote Bill Maher, he calls it COVID classic, like Coca-Cola classic. If it was made for COVID classic, by the time that thing was rolled out, you already had Delta and Omicron was the one that broke through everything. It didn't matter. Now, people didn't wear masks properly anyway, but Omicron was the one that everybody got, but nobody really got sick. So I agree with you on that. And again, I disagree with more of RFK on the COVID vaccine, and I agree more with him big picture on some of the vaccine stuff.
I
But
think that's fair.
I will say this. One thing I do agree with him on in terms of COVID, which is not really about the vaccine, it's about more of how the lockdowns caused potentially more harm than the people that you could have saved through some of these measures. Like, I think we should have social distance. I think we should have masked. Now, people didn't wear the mask properly, but what I'm saying is when you look at some of these stats about all cause mortality, you can make the case that locking people down and shutting down businesses and whatnot, depression, crime, when you have all of these things going on, you can actually potentially have a worse outcome than the virus that you're trying to prevent in some cases. What I'm trying to say is that that's different depending on where you live, right? But I think there's something to that where if you shut everything down and everybody's depressed and they've lost their business and you have depression and suicide and all that, in some cases you can go too far with your restrictions and things can actually be worse. Again, I think that's a fair debate.
Yeah, I agree. And if he made that argument and stopped there, I would think it was totally legitimate. And so I agree with you that a lot of the arguments he makes are fair, but I also think, and again, this is not go look, you can check this anywhere. I think a lot of the statements he says are simply, some of them are simply untrue, some of them are very misleading. And so you're right that we can argue, and it's a totally legitimate debate to argue which lockdowns were effective. For instance, bars and restaurants seem to be very effective because that is how the virus spread, in closed environments where people were eating and drinking. Schools has shown to be not very effective. And I think it's abundantly clear that the juice was not worth the squeeze of closing down schools, and certainly outdoor facilities. That was a complete joke. So there's nuance in that argument, and it's a good argument to have because we may face something like this again. And so to the extent that he raises those issues, I'm totally on board. I think that's a good conversation to have.
All right, I'll tell you what. We're close to an hour. You want to empty the old notebook now, Eric? I always look. I'm a capitalist at heart, and I always think about the ways that we can title these videos. And I think, see, the first half is all Trump and Harris. Now the second half is all RFK, and there's some good titling opportunities with RFK and the dead bear, but also RFK calling Trump a sociopath. So we have a lot of meat on the bone there, not bear meat though. But anything
Yeah.
else? Anything else in your notebook?
I was just checking Walt. So right now, the latest odds are Shapiro 63, Walt's 31, according to presidential election betting odds.com. It's likely to come tonight, or it's certainly by tomorrow because they're going to do it. So Walt seems to be gaining some steam, but Shapiro's still holding the lead. So this is such an interesting decision because Kamala Harris, they've done really well so far, but this is the first big decision she's had to make. And as the Republicans have pointed out, she hasn't done any interviews yet. So I think, look, she's had a great 2 weeks. But as we see with the stock market today, things can just change on a dime. And so the polling has gone pretty well in her direction to the point where this race, I think now is absolutely a toss-up and could go either way. But Trump and his team are certainly not out of this. And if they can hone their attacks and focus more on some of the things we talked about earlier, I think certainly they can get it back. But my prediction is, and God, making predictions, as we know, is fraud. She will pick Shapiro. They will have a good rollout this week. And that by the time we do our next show, she will be the betting favorite to win the presidency. I think she will jump ahead and she will be the betting favorite.
I could see that happening. Okay, I'll tell you what. Let's just shut her down because I got to get this out as soon as possible because probably the second we put it out there, they're going to name that it's Shapiro or Waltz or whatever. So, thank you everybody for watching. Comment, like, subscribe, share the show, share the channel, share the videos. Let's keep it going. We're having a good couple of weeks ourselves. We're starting to build here. People are liking the shows on podcast. On YouTube, more so people like the shorter clips, but still, we're starting to see some good growth, Eric.
I just want to apologize to all our RFK Jr. fan. Not apologize, but I just want to say we can still be friends. Please don't come at me too hard. But look, we can agree to disagree. As I said, I would love to sit down with RFK Jr. and have him tell me all of his conspiracy theories and all of his stories about bears in Central Park. I would really enjoy that.
Hey, your takes on RFK, they're good for business, all right? Let's just say that. It's all good. All right, thank you, sir. We will see you next week.